This is the Onyx Boox Tab Ultra, and it's the most unusual ink tablet you can get at the moment. When it was first announced, I was impressed with the specs, but had some reservations about a couple of things, sounding a bit like empty marketing talk in my opinion. Like Boox Super Refresh Technology. But I'm glad to say that I was wrong, and the device is actually a powerhouse for productivity and has indeed incredibly fast ink refresh rates, just as promised. Not all is great though, because it definitely has some shortcomings, annoyances and potential deal breakers as well. So let's check out what I'm talking about together in this in-depth review and see who I recommend the 10.3-inch Onyx Boox Tab Ultra for and why it's not for everybody. The Boox Tab Ultra design is all about its flat style. Unlike the Boox Note Air 2 Plus, with its rounded edges, the Boox Tab Ultra has sharp edges and flat sides. This very much resembles high-end tablets and smartphones and gives the device a premium feel. The grip area is noticeably narrower than the one on the Boox Note Air 2 Plus, with which I imagine accidental presses can be an issue when holding it in one hand. But for me personally, it wasn't an issue. And with 6.7mm, it's a little bit thicker than the Note Air 2 Plus with 5.8mm. It's not enough for it to feel bulky, but it's noticeable in direct comparison, which most likely has something to do with the boxy build. The front is flush and two-toned, so the bezel around the screen is black, but the grip has a subtle purple colored finish, which I personally like a lot. That color scheme is also present on the matte back side, where we have this ultra branded pattern and the 60 megapixels camera. That's right, the Boox Tab Ultra is an e-ink device with a camera. Right besides it, it says Smart Scanner, which is the main purpose for having it on a device like this. So it's for taking pictures of documents, which we'll have a closer look later on. On the top side of the frame, we have the power button with the fingerprint reader, a microphone, and one of the stereo speakers. Speaking about the power button, which is always a hot topic because its placement never seems to be good enough, I criticized its side placement on the Boox Note Air 2 Plus and Kindle Scribe alike because you can feel the button on your hand when holding the device a certain way. On the other hand, I also mentioned that the button placement on the smaller Boox Leaf 2 can be a problem because accidental presses when standing up the device might be an issue. In case of the Boox Tab Ultra, I think the power button placement is almost perfect, because thanks to the fingerprint sensor, it's flat and wide, and accidental pressing it when standing up the device on the desk hasn't been an issue for me. Okay, so let's continue. On the left side of the frame, there's the connector for the keyboard cover, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment. And on the bottom is the USB-C connector, microSD card slot, another microphone, and the second speaker. And last but not least, the right side is free of any connectors or holes, but has an indicator where to place the pen. The pen placement is a huge upgrade coming from the Boox Note Air 2 Plus. Attaching the pen on the flat side of the device is much more secure. The magnet for holding it is actually so strong that pulling it off the Boox Tab Ultra straight ahead takes a little more effort than on some other devices. Instead of pulling the pen off, I rotate it a little, which is easy and convenient. So the strong magnets are definitely not a bad thing, because with them comes the confidence that the stylus never drops when just slightly touching it wrong. I've lost count at how many times I dropped the pen of the Boox Note Air 2 Plus over the past couple of months, because it's attached so loosely. That hasn't happened once with the Boox Tab Ultra. Okay, so let's talk about what I don't like about the design and build quality, and unfortunately there are a couple of things. One, although the sharp edges and flat sides look great, they are not the best when it comes to haptics. Holding the Boox Tab Ultra in one hand isn't as comfortable as the Boox Note Air 2 Plus. The rounded corners on the leather are much better in everyday use. Two, the Boox Tab Ultra is heavy. With 480 grams, the official specs are in the upper end of what I would classify as acceptable for a 10.3-inch ink device. Unfortunately, that number isn't even correct. My kitchen scale shows a weight of around 502 grams, so over 20 grams more than the already heavy official number, which is disappointing to say the least. So in total, that's 30 grams more than an iPad Pro 11, just to put things into perspective. I guess the heavy weight is mainly a result of the large battery. You can definitely feel the weight difference when comparing it to others in that size segment, which is emphasized by the sharp and boxy build. 3. While the device looks incredibly sturdy, flexing it a little bit will create a crackling sound, which isn't the case with the Boox Note Air 2 Plus. That one feels like a solid block, while the Boox Tab Ultra's crackling noise definitely is less confidence-inspiring. The main problem with this is that it's not just making a noise when actively flexing it for this review, but also when adjusting my hand position during normal use. While I doubt it will become a durability issue, I still find it annoying because it's noticeable when handling the device normally. 4. There are small flaws in the finish that don't match the premium aspirations and high price. The label on the side of the device is weirdly angled, the camera module is also a little crooked, and the microSD card bracket is a bit recessed into the frame, instead of being flush with it. All those things aren't problems in everyday use, but I expect the build quality to match the price, and at least for me, it doesn't. And number 5 is the camera module. As I mentioned, I'll be talking about its function in a bit. But my dislike is about the design, because with over 2mm, it's protruding too much for my taste. So putting the Boox Tab Ultra completely flat on a desk isn't possible and instead results in a bit of wobbling, depending on hand position. But to be fair, it really depends on how you're handling the tablet, and it's not always going to wobble. And when using it with a case, the camera bump is compensated for and isn't an issue at all. Still, with an eNote device, I don't want to compromise on how to handle it when writing, and I guess Onyx came to the same conclusion because the larger Boox Tab X, somewhat surprisingly, comes without a camera module. Let's also quickly talk about the general specs of the Boox Tab Ultra. The tablet has a Qualcomm Snapdragon 662 octa-core CPU and 4 GB of RAM. The Snapdragon 662 is a budget CPU, and the same one as in the Boox Note Air 2 Plus, but more than capable enough for the ink screen. Onyx says there's a dedicated GPU for faster screen refresh rates, which, at least with the tools I checked, didn't show up differently than the GPU on the Boox Note Air 2 Plus. But still, there's a big difference in refresh rate and responsiveness of the screen, which we'll see in a bit. Inputs are done via the capacitive or inductive touchscreen, so either with your fingers or with the pen. The internal storage has 128 gigs, of which around 106 gigs are freely available to the user. That alone would be enough to not have any problems for most people. Together with the microSD card expansion, nobody should have any problems with too little storage. The battery has a capacity of a massive 6300 milliamps, which, as far as I know, is the largest of any consumer electronics ink device. The main reason for it being so huge is most likely the fast ink refresh modes. And not to forget, our Wi-Fi and Bluetooth as wireless connectivity options. So even though the Boox Tab Ultra has built-in speakers, you can also pair it via Bluetooth with external speakers or headphones. Let's talk about the pen, which is obviously an integral part of the user experience. The Onyx Boox Tab Ultra comes with the Boox Pen 2 Pro, which is the more premium version Onyx has in its portfolio. The pen has a smooth surface, one flat side, which attaches to the tablet, and with a weight of 16 grams lies very well in the hand. And with that, it feels much better than the Boox Pen Plus that comes with the Boox Note Air 2 Plus. The stylus also has an eraser function, which sits on top of a button. Pushing the eraser down on the screen and therefore triggering the button will allow you to erase lines very easily and intuitively. The Boox Pen 2 Pro is passive, which means you don't need to charge or bear it. You can simply start writing. As with all digital pens like this, from time to time you need to replace the nib, which seems to last longer than on the Kindle Scribe or Remarkable 2. I suspect this is the case because the Boox Tab Ultra screen is much smoother than on those devices, which results in less wear on the pen. So the writing experience isn't as paper-like as on the other two, but durability of the nib is better as a result. With a latency of only around 20 milliseconds, writing with the pen feels very natural. and is on par with the Kindle Scribe and Remarkable 2. The second important input device of the Boox Tab Ultra is the keyboard cover, which can be purchased separately. The tablet is held in place magnetically with pretty strong magnets. So same as with the pen, I never had any anxiety that the cover comes off by accident. There's also a magnetic strap which covers the pen and also adds to the feeling of having everything secured properly before putting it in the bag. The keyboard itself has a little flex on it, but considering how thin it is, still feels very sturdy. Same goes for the ductility of the keys, which is very good for a keyboard this thin, but obviously not as great as on a regular keyboard. What's working extremely well is the direct connection to the tablet through the pogo pins. So same as with the pen, there's no need to pair or charge the keyboard. Simply put the Boox Tab Ultra in the right position and the user interface switches to landscape and enables the keyboard input. There are three things about it that I don't like, however. For starters, it's pretty heavy. With 412 grams, it adds considerably to the already heavy Boox Tab Ultra, which makes portability a bit worse than what it already is. That's more than the Remarkable 2 weighs. Boox Tab Ultra, Pen 2 Pro and the keyboard cover together weigh around 925 grams. So the full kilo isn't too far away. The material on the outside is also something I'm not too fond of. The artificial leather looks nice but feels way too soft and rubbery. For me personally, that doesn't feel good. But what annoys me the most every time I'm opening the cover is its flappy fold. There's way too much room for movement, which is a problem because the keyboard side is also pretty heavy. So it always becomes this weird balancing act every time I open it. It's rock solid once you have everything in place and the angle the tablet is positioned is great for most situations, but getting there feels like a bit of a hassle every time I'm using it, to be honest. Even after a couple of weeks of using it, you can also use the keyboard cover just like a normal one and fold the keyboard to the back. Since the keyboard needs to be connected physically, it isn't active and pressing the buttons while having it folded isn't an issue. The heavy weight is though, so holding it like that quickly becomes uncomfortable. So I recommend getting the regular flip cover if you intend to use it like that often. And that brings us to the display, which was the biggest question mark and surprise for me. The Boox Tab Ultra uses a 10.3-inch in-character display with a resolution of 227 ppi, which is on par with pretty much every other 10-inch ink device, with exception of the Kindle Scribe, which exclusively has a 300 ppi display at the moment. Make sure to check out my full review of that, linked in the description below. The resolution of 227 ppi means that the screen isn't the sharpest, but still sharp enough to comfortably read any content. Even fully zoomed out large format PDF files are usually no problem. So while I personally definitely prefer the 300 ppi resolution on the Scribe, I would recommend not losing sleep over it. But contrast and light quality are more important in the end, which I will come to in a moment. As I mentioned, the screen surface is smoother and less textured than on the Kindle Scribe or Remarkable 2. The reason for that is, at least partly, the materials in use. Onyx uses aluminosilicate glass for the Boox Tab Ultra, which is the same material we usually see on other tablets and smartphones. You might have heard of Gorilla Glass, which is a similar material and offers a great compromise between scratch and impact resistance. The Boox Tab Ultra doesn't use Gorilla Glass, and I can't say anything about its impact resistance because I haven't dropped it yet. But the scratch resistance of the display is great. The Onyx Boox Note Air 2 Plus has a pre-applied matte screen protector on top of a glossy screen, which is a bit strange, but fine for everyday use, but also means it's much more prone to scratches. After getting it, I managed to scratch the screen protector of the Boox Note Air 2 Plus with just using the device normally. With the Boox Tab Ultra, that can't happen as easily, because the screen itself is matte and hardened and there is no screen protector on there. So doing a crude scratch test with this box cutter leaves no marks on the screen. That's obviously no real-world use case, but it shows that scratches aren't a big concern in everyday use. There is just one downside, which is having a bit more reflections from outside light sources. It's not too distracting and I never had a problem during normal use, but you can notice the difference when comparing it to the competition with more anti-reflective screens. Another improvement over the Boox Note Air series is the thin build of the screen stack. Besides the ink display itself, there are additional layers for the touchscreen and illumination. Why is that worth mentioning? Because the thicker that stack, the less natural the writing experience usually feels, since there's a noticeable distance between the pen and the lines you're drawing. That's not an issue with the Boox Tab Ultra though, as Onyx is delivering on its promise to reduce the thickness of the touchscreen layer. Checking with the flashlight to see how tall the shadows the bezel is casting on the screen are, the Tab Ultra is among the best I have seen so far. It's not as good as the Remarkable 2, but that's no surprise because it doesn't have a front light. The Boox Tab Ultra shares the second place with the Huawei MatePad Paper, but that is using an active pen instead of the passive stylus of the Boox Tab Ultra. With the thinner touchscreen layer, Onyx also promises a 30% better light transmittance. That means less light is absorbed by the layers of the screen, which in turn results in better readability. And same as with the touchscreen's layers thickness, Onyx can deliver on that promise. The ink's display background looks a bit lighter than on the Boox Note Air 2 Plus, which is a sign that it reflects more light. It's not a huge difference, but you can see it when having both devices side by side. Hopefully that's visible on camera too. Besides that, Onyx made another promise in the announcement presentation, claiming that they were able to improve front light uniformity, which is also something which I am glad I can confirm. Same as the Onyx Boox Note Air 2 Plus, the Boox Tab Ultra has a front light with LEDs at the side of the screen, inside the grip. Unlike the Boox Note Air 2 Plus though, the Boox Tab Ultra doesn't have the typical brightness gradient from left to right that usually comes with this type of front light. But not all is great. The front light doesn't have the typical left to right pattern, but still has some brighter parts towards the grip. Here you can see that the top left corner is brighter than the rest of the screen. The big difference, however, is that those halos are subtler in everyday use and as a result less distracting. At least in my eyes. Same as most of the competition, you can adjust the color temperature ranging from bluish cold white in the range of 7600 Kelvin to an orange warm light setting with 3300 Kelvin. Just keep in mind that the LED colors are a bit different from device to device. You can mix the colors without any issues, so anything between warm orange and cold white can be set without color clouds or any problems like that. One of the most interesting announcements Onyx made is the dedicated graphics processor of the Boox Tab Ultra for its Super Refresh Technology. I was skeptical if that would actually hold up in real-world use, and I'm happy to say that it certainly does. Checking out a YouTube video on the Boox Tab Ultra and Note Air 2 Plus side by side clearly shows that the former is much faster. I hope that's also visible after uploading this review to YouTube. But let's be honest, watching videos on an ink screen is a cool gimmick, but more of a testing scenario. It's nice to have if you don't want to switch devices or want to do everything on one tablet, but it usually isn't a typical application on an ink screen. Which doesn't take away from the Boox Tab Ultra's achievement, because having fast ink refresh is only half the story here. The biggest advantage that comes with it is its incredible responsiveness. For ink, that is. Other ink tablets often also implement faster refresh modes, one way or the other, and usually you can only use those to make more dynamic content consumable. But even then, there is usually noticeable lag when interacting with apps, which can be frustrating. Not so on the Boox Tab Ultra. The fast ink refresh translates to a much better responsiveness. Scrolling websites or apps feels so much more direct than on any other ink device. That makes usability definitely more satisfying, and I can't really overstate how great this is in everyday use. But as I said, that's obviously only true when comparing it to other ink devices. A regular tablet with an LCD is obviously still much more responsive. And there's also a cost to pay for the fast ink refresh, which is reduced screen quality and more ghosting. Depending on which mode you're using, those changes will be more or less obvious. So there's certainly a trade-off, which not everybody will be happy with. And the second thing you have to keep in mind is battery life. The reason for the Boox Tab Ultra's massive battery capacity is most likely because of its special screen. One of the main benefits of e-ink is that it only requires energy on refresh, which is perfect for reading static content like an ebook. When contents on the screen continuously change, that advantage disappears. So even though the Boox Tab Ultra has a huge battery, don't expect it to have the best battery life. More on that later. All in all, the Super Refresh technology certainly is refreshing, pun intended, and a great thing to have. Another big change of the Boox Tab Ultra is its user interface. It still uses Android 11, just like the other current Onyx Boox models, but instead of having everything sorted in tabs, it uses a more traditional launcher layout with app shortcuts and widgets. Same as before, the new layout is optimized for the e-ink screen, and in my opinion works much better than the tab layout on the other Boox devices. What didn't change is the pretty steep learning curve when using the device. I guess the new layout somewhat helps because many are familiar with a setup like this from their smartphones or other tablets, but overall there are so many options that it can take some time getting the hang of everything. Okay, let's also talk about Android 11 in more detail. It's not the most up-to-date version of Android, but modern enough so you shouldn't have any issues with running pretty much any app that's suitable for the e-ink screen for quite some time. There are two options to install apps, via the Google Play Store or by sideloading them. Interestingly, the Boox App Store we know from other devices is missing, which to be honest isn't a big loss because it only carries around 35 handpicked apps anyway and has some other issues I'm talking about in the other Boox reviews. So the more interesting option is Google Play, which allows installing and updating apps just like on any other smartphone or tablet. While it sounds great, I'm still not using it with my main Google account for the same reason as with any other Onyx Boox device, because the tablet is calling home, even when not using any Onyx Boox services or having automatic firmware update checks enabled. So what do I mean by that? All smart devices are connecting to servers on the internet on a regular basis. Your phone or tablet do this all the time. I checked the network connection with Wireshark, and there is a lot of connecting to various US servers in Mountain View, which is most likely Google. But I also logged connections to China, which shouldn't be happening since I didn't use any Onyx Boox services and have automatic firmware update detection disabled. There is really no reason to connect to any third-party services at all in my opinion. But to be fair, I also want to mention when first starting up the device, you have to agree to a privacy policy, which states that Onyx adheres to the GDPR, which is the privacy protection law in the EU. The privacy policy now also includes information on the appointed data controller representative in Spain. So that definitely makes me feel a little better when using the device. But to be honest, I'm still not using sensitive data on it, as long as those connections are happening. So depending on what you're aiming to do, keep this in mind. Using a VPN firewall like NetGuard seems to do the trick to block this unwanted traffic. So this could be a good workaround for anyone who is as paranoid as I am. So in the end, I'm still sideloading apps, which means I download APK files from other app stores or directly from the developers, if possible. That's obviously not as comfortable, but the more privacy-friendly option. Most Android apps are obviously not optimized for the black and white ink screen. Nonetheless, many do work without major issues. However, there are two situations that can be a problem: animations and low contrast colors in apps. In both cases, apps might not function as expected, but Onyx included custom ink modes that can in most cases fix any issues. You have 4 different ink modes available, with HD being the default best quality mode. The 3 other modes allow for a faster screen refresh, but also reduce text and image quality, and depending on the mode, also introduce more ghosting than usual. Switching to balanced, fast or ultra fast noticeably reduces text sharpness, which I'm not a big fan of. So I personally use the HD mode 99% of the time because I feel it's perfectly fine for pretty much anything I am doing on the device. Besides those refresh modes, there are also some app optimization options available. You can adjust dark and light colors, change resolution, font rendering, and a few other options. These settings are app dependent, so you can adjust them for specific apps. Thanks to those options, you can basically get any app to work. It's not perfect all of the time, but better than on any other e-ink device. So let's talk about the camera and how to use it out of the box. And spoiler alert, it's not great. As I mentioned, its main purpose is scanning documents. There is no camera app on the device, but a scan documents app. To take a picture of a document, you need to create a scan and assign a name within the app. Thanks to the already mentioned fast refresh modes, the viewfinder works well on the e-ink screen. After taking the picture, you make some basic edits and continue to the final options to either add it to a notepad, create a PDF file, or use OCR to detect text and convert it to typed text. You can edit on the device. While all of those options can be useful in a professional environment and sound great in theory, unfortunately, I have to say they are borderline useless in everyday use, at least for me. And I can already see some viewers getting angry because I start bashing Onyx Boox. But let's just have a look together at what is going on here. Let's start with the OCR function, which needs an active internet connection. That ties into the data privacy issue I mentioned earlier. But okay, it's something I can get behind with because OCR online services are usually more reliable than offline text recognition. And indeed, basic text recognition works fine. Where it starts showing cracks, however, is that it's not placing spaces and punctuation marks correctly. Spaces before and after punctuation marks are placed incorrectly more often than not, which means you have to fix all of those afterwards. The second problem is that text obviously needs to be in focus for the OCR to work correctly. But that's easier said than done for documents with really small text, because when using a fast e-ink refresh mode, like the Boox Tab Ultra is automatically doing with the camera finder, you can't always tell if text is focused correctly. While that's not an issue for large text sizes, it can be a problem for small text documents. And the third issue is the daily OCR limit of only 10 scans you can do. I get that this is a free service Onyx is offering, and it's usable without the need to log in anywhere, but having a camera dedicated for document scanning and then putting a somewhat low limit on its function is a little disappointing. But not all is bad with OCR. Where I was pleasantly surprised is how well it was working for non-regular page layouts. It was able to correctly identify two columns for this document and didn't mix them. Unfortunately, the two other options aren't great either. What I expected to happen was that it worked similar to the document scanning feature on my phone, with the document being corrected in perspective and contrast, up to the point where I could read it on the e-ink screen without major issues, even without the text conversion. But the built-in app doesn't work like that. You can adjust a few basic settings before saving a scan, but it's nowhere near as useful as doing it on my phone. Placing a scan inside a notepad is a simple copy and paste function, which is barely readable most of the time in my opinion. So the better option is to simply use another app with those features, or better yet, set up Dropbox or any other cloud service and use your phone to scan documents and automatically sync those scans to the Boox Tab Ultra. That's maybe a little more inconvenient, but isn't really much slower after first setting it up and works much better in my experience. Worst of all is the PDF option with the firmware I'm currently testing. I'm honestly not even sure what's going on here. No matter how clean I manage to capture the document, I always end up with a completely unusable PDF file like this one. So all in all, I'm not really impressed with the document scanning feature of the Boox Tab Ultra, which honestly I could live with because personally I have no need for it. So it wouldn't bother me if it wasn't for that annoying camera bump on the back side of the device. So not only can I really make use of the scanning features in a meaningful way, I also need to live with the wobbling when using it without a case. That brings us back to a more pleasant function of the Onyx Boox Tab Ultra, reading PDF files. The 10.3-inch display is large and crisp enough to just simply view large format PDF files with good readability already. But more importantly, the viewing options are incredible. The software offers so many different customization options to view PDF files that I doubt you will run into any problems with reading even the strangest formatted PDFs. The standard options include cropping page margins to remove unneeded white space, zooming in and out, and switching the display mode from one page to a scrolling mode where you can simply scroll through the whole document vertically. The best thing about the PDF viewer is the navigation mode, in my opinion. With that mode, the Boox Tab Ultra zooms in on the predefined portion of the page and switches to the next zoomed in section with a tab. This is incredibly useful with multiple columns because you don't have to adjust the viewport manually. And the best thing about it is that you can also customize it. You can choose your own margins and set the viewport, which helps with different format PDFs. And the directions can also be changed. What's especially helpful with this mode are the dotted lines in the zoomed viewport, which help in finding your last reading position quickly when moving to the next section. Besides all of that, you can also manipulate contrast levels, make text bolder, and sharpen images with a few sliders. But there is even more. There is also a split screen mode available for showing two documents besides each other, show a notepad, or open a translation view with Google or Bing Translate. For Google, there's a limit of only 500 words per day, which at least for me doesn't make that option useful. What's a bit more confusing here is that there are actually two different split screen modes available, one native to Android and the other one directly in the e-reader. It's not a big issue, but usually it makes sense to trim duplicate functions in a system to make handling a bit easier. The Notes app is pretty much the same as on the Note Air 2 Plus and is pretty feature-packed. You have the option to change the canvas size, create multiple layers, change the background, create geometrical shapes, write text with the virtual QWERTY keyboard, create more pages, insert images, and create audio recordings. The audio recordings can be placed as shortcuts on pages, which is especially helpful for linking notes to the corresponding audio. Pages can also be copied to other notes, which can be useful when organizing lectures by topic or something like that. I'd say there's a bit of a learning curve to the Note app itself. It's not super hard to get into, but there are many options which sometimes are not 100% clear on how to first use them. I will do a separate video on the note-taking capabilities of the Boox Tab Ultra because it would be too much for this already pretty long review. So make sure to subscribe to not miss that. But all in all, the note-taking functions of the Boox Tab Ultra are pretty great and pretty vast. So there are so many options, and it's not far behind the Remarkable 2 in most cases, and even better in some. Note-taking with the pen works as expected in the PDF file as well. Just use the pen to add notes and markings to a page. And the input works with the same low latency as mentioned previously. Which brings us to the regular reading functions, because after all, you can also do that with the Boox Tab Ultra. The library is clearly arranged with a few options available to filter and sort books on the device. Inside the book, you have a lot of options to customize text stylings, including font size, font weight, anti-aliasing, font family, word spacing, line spacing, paragraph spacing, and page margins. And that's not even all of them, because there are some other options which allow for even more adjustments. Onyx also tidied up the layout and moved some settings to a third tab. Can create notes with the virtual QWERTY keyboard after selecting text and just pin the note to that selection. The dictionary function takes a bit more work to make it usable, because first you have to manually download and install the dictionaries, which is not possible anymore from within the app, which isn't a big loss to be honest, because the selection on older devices was rather limited to begin with. But that means you need to sideload compatible dictionaries yourself, or you use the online translation services from Bing or Google, or look up explanations on the dictionary or another online resource you can add yourself. All of those options are available with a few clicks within the reading app. And also worth mentioning is the awesome text-to-speech option, which works out of the box with the built-in Android TTS function and Google Speech Synthesis. That means you can automatically convert the ebook text you're reading to audio, to which you can either listen using the built-in stereo speakers or with compatible Bluetooth speakers or headphones. The current position is highlighted, which can be helpful if you have a visual impairment, are learning how to read, or if you simply want to listen to the book while you're doing something else. It's obviously not as great as an audiobook, but a useful addition if needed. Audio quality of the built-in speakers is generally very good, even when turning up the volume. Bass, however, isn't the strongest, but that's honestly not a big surprise, since playback focus on an ink tablet usually lies with voice. So listening to the text-to-speech function and audiobooks is pleasant, but listening to music is also a good experience. The built-in ebook store is only worth a short mention because it's just a collection of free public domain titles. You can access it from the main menu and directly download ebooks even without an account. So it's nice to have but not super useful. Unlike with the regular book series, e-notes and e-readers, you can thankfully just remove the shortcut from the main launcher menu, so it doesn't take up space. So if you want to read contemporary literature, you have to use another store, which is easy to do thanks to Android expandability. Let's finally talk about battery life, which is a bit of a head scratcher. As I already mentioned, the battery has a capacity of 6300 milliamps, which is absolutely massive for an ink device, that is. The reason it needs to be this large is the fast refresh modes, which need more energy than it's usually the case with ink. As a side effect, the Boox Tab Ultra is, if I'm not mistaken, the first Onyx device which doesn't power off completely by default after 15 minutes. So by default, it just changes into standby and you can wake it up instantly anytime. Battery drain in standby is barely noticeable and the tablet can last weeks without the need to charge it when not in use. However, the GPU or method Onyx uses to make the Boox Tab Ultra as responsive as it is a silent battery hog when the device is not in standby. That means that there isn't a huge difference if you're reading a book and having mostly static content on the screen, or doing something more dynamic like creating notes or using an app. The more dynamic the content is, and the brighter you set the front light, the faster it drains the battery. That's obviously still true for the Boox Tab Ultra as well. But the difference isn't as pronounced as I thought it would be. What does that mean? Without using the front light and only very light use, like reading an ebook, the battery drops about 1% every 12 to 15 minutes. That means you get around 20 to 25 hours of battery life with light usage, which isn't especially bad, but isn't great either. And it looks like Onyx is aware of this because they limited the standby timeout to a maximum of 15 minutes, which can be annoying because it will put the device into standby even if you're watching or listening to something and haven't actively interacted with the Tab Ultra in those 15 minutes. You can change that limit to 30 minutes by accessing the stock Android settings, but that's the upper limit that's available through the UI. So in other words, even though the battery capacity is massive, don't expect exceptional runtimes even when using the Boox Tab Ultra not too heavily. In fact, for many scenarios, other 10-inch ink devices will last longer than the Boox Tab Ultra. And that brings us to the conclusion of my longest review yet. But there's simply so much to talk about with this device, because the Boox Tab Ultra is one of the most ambitious e-ink tablets we have seen so far. And I didn't want to cut it short. So what do I think? In my opinion, Onyx did a good job at fine-tuning the already great hardware of the Boox Note Air series to bring it to the next level. But I still can't recommend the tablet to everyone, because in terms of value for money, there simply are better ink tablets out there. But let's break it down. What's really standing out on the Boox Tab Ultra is, without the shadow of a doubt, the fantastic screen. Everything about it is great. The thin stack, the scratch resistance, the contrast levels, the lighting quality, and last but not least, the incredible responsiveness never seen before on an e-ink screen. If you're looking for exactly that and other things are secondary, the Boox Tab Ultra is definitely the right choice for you. Software also is very good and offers the best Android experience on e-ink you can get at the moment. The new tablet typical launcher works nicely, the switchable ink modes and app optimization options give a lot of freedom when using apps, and the exceptional PDF functionality is unmatched. Again, if that's what you're after, go for it. Where things get a little murky for me, as already mentioned, are the data privacy concerns, ease of use, small issues with build quality and haptics, the camera, the heavyweight, short-ish battery life, and in the end putting it all together, value for money. The last one being the biggest reason why I can't recommend the Boox Tab Ultra to everybody. The mentioned pros aren't enough to justify the additional cost compared to the Boox Note Air 2 series in my opinion. The Boox Tab Ultra costs $600 US or 650 euros without the keyboard cover. That costs an additional $110. So the total comes down to around $710 or 760 euros. You might get a bundle deal for the keyboard cover, depending on where you get the device, but in the end, your wallet is at least $660 lighter. As great as the unique selling points of the Boox Tab Ultra are, that's a lot of money, and even as a big e-ink fan myself, I have a hard time justifying that cost in relation to other 10-inch eNote devices. So the bottom line is this: if you want the most responsive e-ink screen you can get at the moment, or the best e-ink Android experience, and money isn't an issue, the Boox Tab Ultra is a good choice. If you're willing to compromise on the mentioned downsides, of course. For everyone else, I recommend taking a closer look at the Boox Note Air 2 Plus, which isn't far behind the Boox Tab Ultra in terms of functionality, even better in some aspects, and around $120 cheaper. If you're only looking for a capable note-taking device without the need to have the full Android experience, also take a look at the Kindle Scribe, Lenovo Smart Paper, or Huawei MatePad Paper. All of those have their own strengths and weaknesses, and every single one is cheaper than the Boox Tab Ultra. If you found this video useful, I'd really appreciate it if you take a second and like and subscribe to help with the YouTube algorithm. In any case, thanks for your time watching and see you in the next one.